Mom's fiance stole my $7,000 college savings, and my mom told me to shut up, so I had them arrested. Later, I found out my dad left me a huge inheritance, which my whole family had been using. My mother and her fiance recently got arrested, and my grandparents on my mother's side are giving me a lot of hate for it. This happened because I called the cops on them, and I had a good reason to do so. My mother and I never got along, especially since my dad passed away 10 years ago. I am 17 right now, and in a couple of months, I am supposed to start college. Unfortunately, I had always known that my mother would never have any money set aside for me, so I knew that I would have to work for myself and make my own arrangements. I started working at the age of 14. I would do part-time jobs after school, and I had been saving for the past 4 years so that I would have at least some amount set aside. I would also often get cash from my relatives on my birthdays as gifts and sometimes during the holidays. I set that aside as well, and so far, I had saved up almost $7,000.
I was pretty happy about it.
It was all in cash, of course, and I kept it safely tucked away in a little corner of my cupboard in a wooden box that my father had carved out for me. I did not have a bank account because my mother never allowed me to create one, so that was out of the question. I had never told my mom or anybody else about the money, so I don't know how anybody was able to find it. Anyway, a couple of days ago, I found that the box was entirely empty. When I asked my mom about it, she told me that her fiancé had taken the money to invest in his new house. I completely lost my mind when I found out what happened. There was a huge fight in the house with me on one side and my mom and her fiancé on the other. At the end of the day, I am just 17, and they hold the power right now. I had to concede, and the only thing I could do was walk up to my room, lock myself in, and cry for hours. This was my life, and I would have to start from scratch yet again. I wasn't even sure if I would be able to save enough money for anything before college, and I was just really disheartened and completely lost. That was the day that I made up my mind. I was going to get back at them for this because this could not go unanswered. It was pretty big, but thankfully I was able to get my revenge exactly 3 days later. Now they have been arrested and are paying for the crime they committed. My only problem in this entire scenario is that my grandparents, who had always been on my side so far, are now against me. It just doesn't make sense to me anymore. My mom's fiancé, Rob, has been in my life for the past 2 years, and I've hated every single second of it because he is literally one of the most terrible people I've ever met. I would even go so far as to call him abusive, probably not physically, but definitely verbally and emotionally. My mom usually bears the brunt of it, but occasionally he loses his temper with me as well and says whatever comes to his mind. He curses me out, tries his best to make me cry, and gets even more pissed off when he realizes that I don't care. This leads him to lose even more control of his tongue. My mother never bothers to defend me. My mother didn't date anyone for the first couple of years after my dad passed away, but then she met Rob. For the first few months, he was nice and tolerable, but then they had their first big fight. That's when he started showing his true colors. 6 months into their relationship, he had already started manipulating my mom and managed to move in with us. He's a no-good deadbeat and can barely stick to any job. For context, Rob is in his mid to late 30s and still relies on his parents for money occasionally because he has absolutely zero financial sense. He constantly wastes money, way more than he earns. When he's fighting with my mom, he takes money from his parents, and when he's not fighting with her, he's comfortable enough to leech off of her. The sad part is that my mother isn't exactly wealthy. She's the floor supervisor at our local supermarket, and while she brings home a decent amount, it's not enough for the kind of lifestyle Rob wants. Anyway, I never let it become a problem for me. I've always tried to be as independent as I can. Right from the age of 14, I've avoided asking my mother for anything apart from basic necessities. After I started working part-time, I didn't even ask her to pay for those. I don't ask her to buy me anything, and the only thing I rely on her for is shelter and food. That's it. I don't ask her to do anything extra for me or go out of her way, because I know that even expecting that is pretty foolish. She has made it very clear to me from the beginning that she doesn't like me. Even when I was a child, she was never very nice to me, and I always had this feeling that she didn't even want me. As I grew older, that feeling strengthened into a belief. At least when my dad was alive, he would have my back and stand up to my mom whenever she got a little too pissed at me. But after he passed away, I was on my own, and that's how it has been for the past couple of years. Things just started getting worse when Rob came around, but I always consoled myself by thinking that soon enough, I would leave for college and wouldn't have to worry about any of this. Now, that dream seems bleak and unlikely. For the 3 days after my money was stolen, I stayed in my room and didn't do anything because I was so depressed. The day after I learned that all my money had been taken, we moved into our new house. I did all the work I was required to do, but I didn't speak to either of the two people living with me. They didn't seem to care. On the third day, my mother told me to get dressed in the evening because they were hosting a housewarming party. I started screaming at her, telling her that I wasn't going to do anything of the sort because she had taken my money from me. I told her the only reason they had been able to seal the deal and buy this house was because of the money they had stolen from me. That really pissed my mother off. She told me that now that we were finally living in our own house and not a rented place, I should be happy for them. She said I needed to just suck it up and let this one go because I owed them for life anyway. She referred to the fact that she had raised me, which doesn't even make sense because that's something she was legally bound to do. It wasn't as though she'd done me any huge favors. As for the house, it was too big for the three of us anyway. I knew they had bought it just to be able to impress everyone with their upmarket address and spacious home. I was really upset that day, and I decided to do something I hadn't done before. I called up my father's parents. It was kind of complicated because, after my dad passed away, my paternal grandparents had distanced themselves from our family. I assumed it was because it was too painful for them to keep in touch. I don't know why they cut ties with us, but we weren't on speaking terms anymore. However, I still had their phone numbers. As a last resort, I decided to call them. Thankfully, they answered my call. As soon as they picked up, I told them everything that had happened. I explained how I had worked hard for years to save up for college and that my mother and her fiance had stolen my money. I begged them for help, saying that if my dad were still alive, he would have wanted to do something to help me. After listening to me, my grandfather told me something that left me stunned. He said the situation was confusing because my dad had left a college fund for me before he passed away. He didn't understand why I had to save up separately.
This was news to me.
My mother had never mentioned anything about a college fund, and I had never asked because I assumed she wouldn't have anything set aside for me. It had simply never crossed my mind that my dad might have done something like this for me before he passed. After all, he died relatively young, and I figured he hadn't had the time or resources to plan for my future. But hearing my grandfather mention the college fund made me furious. I realized that my mother and Rob must have used that money for their own purposes. I asked my grandparents if they had any proof of this, something I could use against my mom. They promised to look for documents and get back to me. For the next few hours, I sat in my room, trying to piece everything together. It became increasingly clear that my mom and Rob had teamed up to steal both my savings and the college fund my dad had left for me. I was furious, but I needed concrete evidence before taking action. Later that day, my grandparents called me back and sent over photos of some documents. These documents showed that my father had indeed left a college fund for me. What's more, my mother had signed legal papers stating that the money was to be used exclusively for my education and to ensure I led a comfortable life. Seeing those documents made my blood boil because my mom had done the exact opposite. Instead of securing my future, she had used the money for herself and her fiancé. With the proof in hand, I called a friend of mine whose dad works in law enforcement. I told him everything that had happened and asked for his advice. He told me to gather all the evidence and file a report with the police. After learning that Rob and my mom had taken my money and used it to buy the house, I couldn't let it go unanswered. I called my father's parents, my paternal grandparents, for help. They had distanced themselves from us after my dad passed away, likely due to the pain of losing him. I hadn't spoken to them in years, but I still had their number. Desperate, I explained everything to them over the phone. To my surprise, my grandfather revealed something shocking. My father had left a college fund for me before he passed away. My mother had never mentioned it. My grandfather explained that he thought the fund was still intact, as it had been explicitly left for my education. He sent me pictures of documents showing that my father had set aside the money for me, with my mother signing an agreement to ensure the funds were used for my education and well-being. Furious, I realized my mom and Rob had likely used my college fund to buy their new house. It made sense. There was no way Rob, who hadn't held a steady job, and my mother, who didn't earn enough for such an extravagant purchase, could have afforded it otherwise. Armed with the documents from my grandparents, I decided to take action. I reached out to a family friend whose dad is a police officer. After explaining everything, the officer agreed to help me. That evening, during my mom and Rob's housewarming party, the police arrived and arrested them for misusing the college fund my dad had left for me. The party guests, including my mom's and Rob's friends and coworkers, were stunned. Some left immediately, while others stayed to witness the spectacle. My mom and Rob glared at me as they were taken away in handcuffs, but I didn't care. I felt a sense of justice for the first time in years. After they were arrested, my maternal grandparents, who had always been on my side, suddenly turned against me. They accused me of being ungrateful and said I shouldn't have involved the police. I was left alone in the house, confused and heartbroken. Even though I knew I had done the right thing, I felt lost and betrayed by my remaining family. I've since moved out of the house Rob and my mom bought. After being in custody for 48 hours, they were released on bail and came back home. I had already packed my belongings and left as soon as they returned. I'm currently staying with my friend, whose dad helped me with the arrest. They've been incredibly supportive, and their kindness has been the only bright spot in this mess. We've scheduled a mediation session with a court-appointed mediator to negotiate a settlement. While I'm determined to reclaim the funds meant for my education, I've also prepared myself for the possibility that this might go to court. My friend's father, who is helping me with legal advice, has reassured me that I have a strong case. As for my maternal grandparents, they've completely cut ties with me. I feel disappointed and hurt, but I'm learning to accept that not everyone will have my back, even those I considered family. A shocking development came to light just 2 days before the mediation session. My mother emailed me, confessing that not only had she used my college fund, but other family members, including both sets of my grandparents, had conspired with her to misuse the money. She provided screenshots of emails exchanged between her, my maternal grandparents, and my paternal grandparents, discussing how they would divide the funds. I was livid. This betrayal cut deeper than anything else. My paternal grandparents, who had sent me the documents to help my case, had only done so because of guilt. They had initially agreed to remain silent, but decided to come clean when I reached out to them. Even so, their complicity in the theft of my inheritance was unforgivable. At the mediation session, I presented the new evidence against my mother and all 4 of my grandparents. My mother admitted to the theft but argued that some of the money had been used for my upbringing. I countered that my grandparents had no excuse for their involvement and demanded full repayment of the funds. The mediator suggested a settlement, but my mother and grandparents resisted. My lawyer has advised me to take this case to court. It might take years, but I'm determined to reclaim what's rightfully mine. For now, I've taken out a student loan to start college. It's not an ideal solution, but I won't let their betrayal derail my future. I've also decided to cut ties with my family permanently. Their actions have shown me that they can't be trusted, and I need to prioritize my well-being and independence. Thank you for reading and supporting me through this journey. Your encouragement has given me the strength to fight for my future. If anything changes, I'll provide another update. For now, I'm focusing on building a life free from the toxicity of my family.